20 years of marriage is a significant part of life. My wife, Linda, and I started out as an ordinary couple who dreamed of having a family, a home together, and a happy future. We got married young, and everything seemed to be going well. Ordinary joys and problems, children, work, all this shaped our lives. Over time, however, I began to notice that we were living more apart than together. Evenings became quiet, and conversations became short. Our plans for the future were replaced by discussions of bills and everyday trivialities. She always looked busy, but never shared what she was doing. And I never asked either. At first, I didn't pay attention to it. I thought it was a normal part of a long marriage, getting used to the routine, losing that youthful passion. But something inside me said that this was not just a routine, that we were slowly but inevitably moving away from each other. At the same time, I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. After all, we were still together, living under the same roof, sharing a life together. But with each passing day, this life was becoming more like the coexistence of two people who had forgotten why they had decided to be together in the first place. I thought that these were just temporary difficulties that could be overcome. But I didn't even realize that this detachment hid something that would completely change my life. Over time, the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. Linda began to spend more and more time away from home. Her excuses sounded convincing. Work, meetings with friends, various urgent matters. But something in her behavior made me wary. She often didn't answer her phone, and when I asked her about her day, she answered quickly and evasively, as if she wanted to end the conversation as soon as possible. One evening, when she came home later than usual, I decided to start a conversation. "Linda, is everything okay? You seem tired lately." She turned away, folded her arms across her chest, and replied, "Yes, everything is fine. Just a lot to do." I felt a sense of unease rise in my chest, but decided not to push. Instead, I began to notice details. She started dressing more often in a way that she usually only wore for special occasions. New perfume, expensive dresses, none of this was part of our normal life. When I asked her why she dressed like that to meet her friends, she just smiled. "Is it bad? I want to feel confident." But the biggest blow I got was when I happened to see her phone. It was on the table when she went to the shower. I wasn't in the habit of checking her stuff, but something in me screamed that it was important. The messages on the screen were from a man named Mark. "I miss you" was the last thing I saw before the screen went off. I couldn't believe my eyes. Mark? Who is this? My brain refused to accept it, but my heart already knew the answer. I decided not to say anything right away. I needed more information. The next few weeks were a real test for me. I started to pay attention to every little thing. Her smiles when she received messages, her hasty explanations, her aloofness. One day, I even decided to follow her when she said she was meeting her friends. She did not go to a restaurant or cafe, as she said. Her route ended at a private house on the other side of town. She got out of the car, looked around quickly, and went inside. That was the moment when I realized that my suspicions had become reality. She was lying to me. Our marriage, our 20 years together, all of it now seemed like an illusion. I stood in my car, not knowing what to do next. I had two choices: confront her or continue to remain silent while collecting evidence. I returned home that evening without saying a word. At night, I lay in bed listening to her steady breathing and felt the anger and frustration boiling inside me. I no longer recognized the woman with whom I had lived my entire adult life. What had made her do this? What had I done wrong? All these thoughts were running through my head, but I decided that I would no longer leave it at the level of suspicion. The next day, I decided to get answers, no matter how painful they might be. The next day, I decided not to wait and not to make elaborate plans. I knew where to find her. Her habit of going to meetings after work had become so regular that I just decided to follow her. I had no desire to hire detectives or collect evidence for the court. I wanted to see everything with my own eyes. That evening she said, "I'm going to be late. I have a meeting with my colleagues." This was a standard excuse lately. She always came back late, and she always looked more careful than usual. I answered briefly, "Okay, take your time." As soon as she drove off, I got in the car and followed her. Her path took me out of town to a small restaurant on the outskirts. It was a quiet place, perfect for those who want to go unnoticed. I parked so that I had a good view and waited. A few minutes later, Mark showed up. He got out of his car, looked around, and confidently walked into the restaurant. I sat in the car, looking at the door that closed behind them. My heart was beating like crazy, but my head was absolutely silent. I got out of the car and came closer. I saw them through the window. They were sitting at a table in the corner, smiling at each other. Mark leaned closer, and Linda touched his arm. Everything was clear without words. I went back to the car and got behind the wheel, but I couldn't bring myself to drive. Instead, I sat there, staring into the darkness, trying to decide what to do next. Confrontation in the restaurant? It would be a classic dramatic gesture, but would it change anything? I decided to wait. I had one advantage. They didn't know I was there. When they left the restaurant, I followed them again. Their route led me to a small hotel nearby. I saw them enter together, and that was enough. My suspicions turned into reality, and it became the worst evening of my life. The next morning I decided that I would not remain silent any longer. When Linda came home, I was waiting for her in the kitchen. My demeanor was calm, but my emotions were boiling inside. "How was your meeting?" I asked when she came in. She looked a little surprised, but quickly pulled herself together. "It was good. We resolved several important issues." "I wonder what issues were resolved in the restaurant with Mark?" I replied, holding her gaze. She froze. Her face turned pale, and she couldn't find anything to say. I continued, "I saw you in the restaurant, and not only there." She sat down on a chair and covered her face with her hands. "John, I don't know how to explain it." Her voice was quiet, almost defenseless. "Explain it? It doesn't need explaining. You chose betrayal over honesty," I replied. "I didn't want it to come to this," she began. "I thought you didn't notice me anymore, that we were just living next door to each other. And you decided that the best way to solve this was to find someone else?" I asked, no longer hiding my anger. "Why didn't you just talk to me?" She didn't say anything. Her silence spoke more than any words. She had made her choice, and that choice destroyed everything we had built for 20 years. This conversation was the last straw. I realized that I didn't want to try to fix anything anymore. The same day, I started looking for a lawyer and preparing for a divorce. Linda tried to talk to me a few more times, but I didn't listen to her words anymore. They were empty, just like our marriage. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I would not stay in this lie any longer. After that night, everything changed. Not only did I feel angry, but I also wanted to get justice. I couldn't just walk away and leave it at that. My dignity demanded action, and I decided that they both had to pay for what they had done. The first step was to cut off all financial ties. I carefully checked our accounts, loans, and other obligations. I transferred everything that was registered to me to my personal accounts, leaving Linda without access to our joint money. I also stopped paying for her credit card, which she had been using heavily lately. It was a blow that she did not expect. The next step was to work with a lawyer. I prepared the divorce papers, which detailed the reasons, including infidelity. The law in this state was on my side, and I had enough evidence to get favorable terms for the division of property. Linda didn't even have time to recover when she received the subpoena. Her comfortable world began to crumble. But that was not enough. I knew that Mark, my former friend and her lover, had to suffer his share of the consequences as well. He worked for a company with which I had close professional ties. I informed the management about his personal actions, using the same evidence I had in my hands. This did not go without consequences. His reputation in the company was destroyed, and his career went downhill. My last step was to hire a professional photographer who took several photos of their meetings. I did not intend to publicly humiliate them, but these photos became the basis for a fair trial. They were another nail in the coffin of their attempts to save face. During those few weeks, I felt like I was regaining control of my life. My desire for revenge gradually faded, giving way to peace. Linda tried to call me several times, but I ignored her calls. Our communication now took place only through lawyers. Mark, as far as I heard from my friends, lost not only his job, but also the trust of many people. His life, which seemed so successful, was now ruined because of his own actions. Linda was left alone, with his excuses and an empty house that was no longer ours. I realized that revenge is not always about destroying another. It is about restoring yourself. I got my dignity and freedom back, and now I was ready to leave it all behind to start a new life. After all these events, my life changed dramatically. I left behind everything that connected me to Linda and Mark. She no longer had access to my life, and even her attempts to regain at least minimal trust through her friends were in vain. My path was only forward. I moved to a new city, where I started all over again. A small, cozy apartment became my new home, and work became the main way to distract myself. I focused on myself, the gym, traveling, and meeting people who added energy to my life rather than taking it away. One day, sitting in a cafe, I met a woman named Eliza. She was simple, sincere, and had the kindness in her eyes that I had been missing in recent years. We started talking, and it was completely different from what I was used to. There were no lies, no secrets, no feeling of being used. It was sincere. Over time, I realized that I no longer thought about the past. Linda and Mark were just lessons that taught me to value myself and my limits. Their fates no longer interested me. I heard that Linda was trying to find a new life, but without success. Mark, as far as I knew, left the city because his reputation was completely destroyed. But those were their problems, not mine. I looked at it all from a different perspective. The betrayal that once seemed like the end of the world now looked like a new beginning. I learned that I had the strength not only to survive, but to become better. Revenge gave me initial relief, but real peace came when I started living for myself, not because of them. One evening, while walking with Eliza, I stopped to watch the sunset. She took my hand and asked me, "What are you thinking about?" I answered, "About how good it is to leave the past behind." And it was true. I was no longer the man who allowed others to control his life. I was stronger, freer, and finally happy. It was my new beginning, and I knew that this time it would be different.